Hello, everybody. Haven't done Bits and Bytes in a couple weeks. Actually, this makes 3 weeks that we haven't done Bits and Bytes. My name's Mike. You may remember me from there, or if you happen to have stumbled across us through my blog from there. It's actually my first video blog that I've done. Wanted to kind of go back, cover some of the news from a couple weeks ago, try and get everything caught up. There's been a lot of things that have continued to happen that I think are worthwhile talking about, and at least making sure everybody out there is aware. Just some kind of best practices type stuff. So I'm going to cover the things from 3 weeks ago, basically because I go through and I gather up these articles each week, regardless of whether or not we've done Bits and Bytes. And I want to cover the stuff from 3 weeks ago. Then I figure in a day or so, I will go through the stuff that I had scheduled from 2 weeks ago, and then this past week, and then maybe we can all sync back up and be able to have a regular live web stream again. I'm not quite comfortable to the point of testing out video equipment to do that yet. However, I am using OBS, which is the open broadcasting system, same thing that Charlie uses for his eval after hours. I've got a couple simple scenes set up for this webcast, and probably do some more advanced stuff later on as I play with the system. But without further ado, I want to go ahead and start talking about some of the things from 3 weeks ago. Google+, which most of you may be familiar with out there. Those of you who aren't, Google+ is a social media platform put forth by Google. It was actually during the social media wars, I guess, when Twitter started really becoming popular, as did Facebook and everything like that. MySpace started dying off. This was Google's solution. Not a lot of people actually used Google+. I think I went in there and set up a profile one time. It just never really took off. I think Facebook basically beat it to the punch on that. But they recently had a bug that leaked information about all their 500,000 accounts, which a lot of those were probably either duplicates or set up accidentally from someone that was setting up Hangouts, which is usually how Charlie and I do our web stream when we do Bits and Bytes. But basically, there was an API leak. APIs are programmable interfaces. So basically, there's syntax code. Basically, you can query information from a website, such as, you know, if you've ever seen on a website where they have how many Facebook likes they have or something of that nature, those are through APIs. And basically, there was something like that that caused data to be leaked for all these individuals. And this was ultimately what caused Google to finally pull the plug on Google+. The lack of popularity and then combination of having this data breach, it just wasn't worth picking up the pieces. So Google has decided to pull the plug on that. I will provide the links in the video or in the description of the video, so that way you guys can read further if you'd like. Speaking of breaches and data leaks, one of the articles I thought was rather interesting. Based off of the first half of 2018 and how many data breaches we've had and how many records have been involved, there's been roughly 291 records breached per second in the first half of 2018. And just to kind of give you kind of a scale where everything's at, there was about 4.5 billion records across 945 breaches, which is about 4.8 million records per incident so far. In 2017, there was about 2.6 billion, so almost half, across 1,765 incidents. So there was almost double the amount of incidents. However, there was a lot less records that were actually compromised. So it's been pretty substantial this year as far as how much information has been leaked through data breaches. Now that's roughly 1.47 million records per incident, so significantly less based off of the amount of total records divided by how many incidents there were. In 2016, there were 554 million records across 974 incidents. That was less than a million. There was 569,255 records per incident based off of that. And then going back even as far as 2015, it was roughly half of that. Roughly the same amount of incidents, so it's kind of interesting. The incidents really haven't changed that much, but the amount of information that has been compromised each time is substantial. It talks a little bit about malicious outsiders, which basically are your attackers. That's your criminal organizations or what have you that are trying to compromise systems either by breaking into databases or holding information ransom. That's your malicious outsiders. malicious insiders. Maybe one of these days I'll do a webcast talking about those. Those are your internal employees or people inside your company that may potentially be causing damage, whether intentional or not. Accidental losses. One of the things that I find kind of interesting regarding this is not particularly from this incident, but if anybody reads the data breach investigations report that Verizon puts out every year, they've been doing it for around 10 or so years. They talk about both things in the digital realm for data breaches, as well as things like one of the things I found most interesting was there was a filing cabinet that was sold at auction from some hospital somewhere that was still full of files and nobody checked it. And to me, I have a filing cabinet, just a 2-drawer one, and it's, even when it was full, most of my stuff's digitalized now, but even when it was full, it was really heavy. I don't know how you can not know that a filing cabinet is full of files, but that kind of stuff still happens too. And that would probably fall under the accidental loss or negligence. But I thought it was kind of interesting how many, kind of gives you a perspective of how much damage is actually being done with each of these data breaches, especially as time goes on. Something else that came up a couple weeks ago, default passwords on webcams. Obviously, the webcam like I have that's USB plugged into my computer doesn't really have a password, but your wireless webcams, people that may have cameras set up so they can see their children in their house, or maybe surveillance cameras, that kind of stuff, most of those still have a login or a password. And a lot of people don't change those from the default, so it may be admin, admin password, same kind of things that you have for routers. And one of the main problems with that is things like botnets. So Mirai, which was one of the big botnets, was basically composed of Internet of Things. So your IoT devices, surveillance cameras, webcams, internet-connected toasters, internet-connected fridges, basically anything, light bulbs, pretty much anything that you connect to the Internet that is not like a network device or a computer or a phone, something that's basically just a standard piece of equipment that has additional capabilities now by connecting it to the network or to the Internet. But a lot of times these devices basically become part of this botnet, and through that they can be used to attack other devices through distributed denial of service attacks, or they may be used to further spread the infection between devices because they may have to brute force other passwords for the people that do actually change them, or something of that nature. So some other things about particularly webcams and not changing the passwords. A lot of times they can be used to spy on the individual because if an attacker can actually get access to that device to be able to use it to generate traffic. They could also potentially use it to spy on the owner. A lot of times that kind of stuff happens usually towards females just because it's used for sextortion at that point. But they can use it to spy on you. I mean, you probably wouldn't want somebody looking at your kids or watching your kids when you're not there, especially if they can track you down based off of the IP address. So change your passwords. You don't want people spying on you because they can be able to do that. Another aspect is it may be used to pivot on throughout a network. So it may be used to gain persistence. So in the event of a business, it may be used to gain a foothold on that device that's basically connected, and then use that device not only to maybe attack other people on the internet, but maybe also to try and pivot internally or to move laterally throughout your organization to try and compromise servers or other data or something else that may be on your network. So again, anytime you have these types of devices, make sure that you change the passwords, just because if nothing else, you're defending your environment and protecting yourself from somebody spying on you in the case of a webcam. Speaking of unpatched devices and devices with default credentials, a lot of times routers, especially consumer routers, don't actually get patched. So they don't get the updates. And these devices, just like Windows, Adobe Flash Player, Java, any of those type things, your web browser, those all actually need to be updated regularly. So when a new release comes out, there's a reason for it. Sometimes it's new features, but most of the time it's going to be security patches, fixing vulnerabilities that may be there, and trying to harden the device to where it's actually safe to have connected to the internet and not potentially compromise the rest of your network. Most modern day routers from a consumer perspective have like automated updates. So you can actually just log in when you go in and change your password. So you just like with the webcams, don't leave default credentials, change your password. Change it to something rather difficult, because anybody that is on your network, whether it be neighbors, family, friends, if you have that as a default, they can get in there and maybe make changes to it that you wouldn't want them to be able to do. So always change your default credentials. But when you do that, also go in and see if there's some sort of automated update that you can set. Routers are, for the most part, not all that expensive. Very rarely do they brick from an automatic update, unless it's you happen to lose power in the middle of it actually updating, which is very infrequent, for at least for most people, I guess. Some people may have more power issues than others. In the next scenario, I would recommend getting a UPS and plugging it into that. That way, if there's that temporary power blip, it's not going to be too much of an issue. But always see if you can update those. Those that don't may still have a, like, where you can click to check and see if there's an update out. If it is, obviously install it. Sometimes they don't even require a reboot. Depends on the device. But definitely check for those, because if they're left with the unpatched original firmware, there may be vulnerabilities that have come out, such as things like Mirai or other types of botnets that are trying to compromise your device. Again, it goes back to don't enable remote administration. Like we've talked about several times with Bits and Bytes, don't have the remote administration ports open unless you know what you're doing. Make sure that you have changed your default credentials, but also trying to keep everything up to date. There could also be stability issues. That's another reason that patches come out. So maybe you have an issue of every so often your wireless just goes out. You have to reboot your router to get everything working again. There may be a fix for that in a patch. So another thing that I highly recommend to do that, because it makes your environment more stable too. That's pretty much all I have to say about unpatched routers for right now. The next thing, I actually really want to do a long write-up on my blog about sextortion scams, because there's been a lot of them lately, and the tactics have gotten very sophisticated. A couple months ago, the tactic that they were using was using passwords that were actually associated with the email they were sending these extortion attempts to, from data breaches, to try and get you into to trick that fear factor into making you think that they have something on you that they don't actually have. They basically just have all these credentials from a data breach, but it seems like they may have intimate knowledge of your network or your devices. And then to furthermore go beyond that, their latest thing that they were doing is they've started to spoof it coming from your email account. So it makes it look like not only do they have access or maybe your password to your email account, but it looks like it actually came from you to you. So they're trying to say, hey, I can see everything that you have in your email. I've sent this to you. Obviously, I have control of your email account if I was able to send an email to you from you. Honestly, from a spoofing standpoint, there are some other aspects I'm not going to get into for email security. But for the most part, spoofing an email address is very trivial. It's almost comparative to the equivalent of being able to write somebody else's address on a physical envelope and say that it came from them. I remember when I worked at an ISP and I was having this discussion about how easy it was to spoof email addresses. One of my coworkers at the time didn't believe me, and at the time I was working on a simple little web application that was using PHP SendMail to simply just send an email without actually having a server to send it through. And I just quickly came in, changed a couple lines where the origin email that it was sending was and who it was actually sending to, executed the script and sent him an email from himself to himself. Even though I had no access to his email account, didn't know what his passwords were, didn't matter. Basically, I was just able to spoof his email address so that it looked like it came from him. So it's very trivial to do this kind of thing. So if you happen to get one of these and they are saying, so here's an example. It says, I'm a member of an international hacker group, as you could probably have guessed. Your account, and then they have their email address, was hacked because they sent you a message from your account. If you get any of these types of emails, these are just scams. Don't actually believe them. Unless there's other suspicious things that are going on in your account. For the most part, these are just spray and pray type emails. They get a whole bunch of information from data breaches, like I said, and then they send these types of emails out, such as the sextortion emails that were coming out earlier in the year, and try and convince you that they have something on you or that they have the control of one of your accounts, so that way you'll pay them money. And ultimately, that's what this usually boils down to, is it's just an extortion for Bitcoin or Monero or Litecoin or one of the other cryptocurrencies typically. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, Again, this was 3 weeks ago. Unfortunately, not a lot has really changed in this whole debacle. There's still, Bloomberg's still standing by what they said, that the chips are actually on the boards. We still don't have 100% proof one way or the other. And in addition to that, there have been basically plenty of people that are saying, no, this is false. This isn't actually happening. So there's a lot of investigation that's still going on. So we don't know whether or not Apple, Amazon, or government agencies or anything have been actually compromised from some hack from China. So again, I'm still sticking with the hypothetical that this situation may or may not even be true. However, there are some things that are very highly recommended to do, even if it is true. One of the things that the article recommends is, and this one's probably one of the most important in my opinion, partition your networks. Segregate things out. Use VLANs and this strictly is more towards the business side of things. Again, these were supposedly on server motherboards, not something the home user is necessarily going to have. In the event that you happen to be a home user or something like this, consider segregating your network. If you do have like business appliances or business servers and stuff like that at your house. But partition your networks. And what I mean by that is separate things out based off of level of importance or level of risk. So in the event of a small business, you may have a couple different printers, put those on their own network. Printers are widely attacked, as Charlie and I have talked about before. Phones, those should be on their own networks. Servers, depending on what exactly is running on the server, you may want to actually segregate based off of apps. But you need to separate these things, not just from a like VLAN and broadcast perspective, to separate the noise and the traffic for an overhead standpoint, but you also want to filter out what can talk to what. So that way, in the event that you do have something like this and it is a persistent device in your network, maybe it can't access your database servers, or maybe it can't access your email server or something, or your EHR or your banking system, something of that nature. You want to try and protect the critical pieces of your business, and the best way to do that is to separate out your networks. And just as you don't want every single employee to be able to access every single thing in your organization, same too with network devices. You don't want them to be able to access every single other thing on the network, just because there's no necessity to do it, and it causes a huge vulnerability. The second thing I mentioned was using two-factor authentication. So for the case of, it talks about how it's modifying kernel code and ensuring that all password checks succeed, using some external factor such as Google Authenticator or something, depending on what exactly it is you're doing. So if it's a VPN or something, being able to do that may help secure those devices a little bit better. And then probably the most important from a auditing standpoint is keeping logs and actually using them. A lot of times logs are kept on a centralized server or on the device themselves, and they're never looked at unless there's actually an issue. And trying to go back through logs that have not been properly parsed, or may go back years trying to find an issue, is so time consuming that most organizations don't even do it. So if you do have the capabilities or have a business type network, set up a centralized logging repository. It doesn't have to be fancy, even if you're just using something like rsyslog, just something to basically collect those logs. If you can afford to go the route of having a SIM or something to actually try and parse those logs, pull out intelligence from them, even if you can set up something like Elasticstack or Security Onion, that way you can actually have something to help you parse those and be able to get something useful out of them. Highly recommend doing that, just because it can help you know if something's going on in your environment, especially if you haven't been able to do something like partitioning off your network. Phones will never need to talk to printers, period. There's no logical reason for them to do so. If you happen to see in your logs that the phones are conversing with the printer network, or even your server network other than maybe your VoIP system, it's probably time to start investigating why. There may be some other malware on the device itself, something that's come from like a webcam or something else in the environment that's pivoted to that network, or there may just be a malfunction in the device and it's causing unnecessary traffic and it needs to be filtered out. So definitely keep track of your logs, pay attention to them, keep your network separated, and I think that's, for the most part, really all I have today. So at least from a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago to be exact, this was kind of the news stories that I put together that I wanted to talk about on Bits and Bytes. Like I said, this is my first actual little video blog. The reason I'm doing it, the reason I'm going back 3 weeks, I still think the stuff's relevant. I still think it's something to talk about, and I can do it via video a lot faster than I can do writing up a blog entry. I'm very picky when I'm trying to make sure that everything's written up correctly. So I don't want to try and, especially when it comes to discussing things of this nature. So if you look back on my blog and see some of the older articles, they are rather long, and I'm trying to get away from doing that as often unless I'm doing a real deep dive on a particular subject. So I have a few more articles for the next video to discuss the things from 2 weeks ago, but again, I'll put the links in the bottom of the video. Feel free to like, share as necessary, and I'll see you next time.